Most people view home as a sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world fades behind a closed door. But for Arthur Vance, home had turned into a slow-burning courtroom where he was permanently on trial for a crime he didn't commit. Every time an engine idled too long in his driveway, every time he trimmed the hedge along his property line, or simply walked out onto his porch after dark, he waited for the sound of red and blue sirens turning down his quiet suburban street. For 3 straight years, his next-door neighbor made sure he never forgot that in her eyes, he was a threat waiting to happen. You have to wonder, how much injustice can a person take before their capacity for kindness simply burns away? Arthur Vance was a 58-year-old retired Army logistics specialist who had spent 24 years serving his country in structured, unpredictable environments. When he retired, he wanted nothing more than absolute quiet. He bought a modest, cedar-siding home in the damp, heavily wooded town of Oakridge, Oregon. He spent his mornings restoring vintage furniture in his garage, his afternoons tending to a small vegetable patch, and his evenings sitting on his back porch with a warm mug of black coffee, watching the coastal mist settle over the tall pines. For the first 6 months, the neighborhood felt like paradise, but that peace was short-lived. It began the month Evelyn Croft moved into the gray house directly across the narrow asphalt road. Evelyn was a woman in her late 60s, thin, sharp-featured, and perpetually guarded. She kept her blinds drawn tightly at all hours of the day. At first, Arthur tried to be welcoming. He walked across the street with a small batch of freshly baked bread from the local bakery, intending to introduce himself as a friendly neighbor. He never even made it to the front door. As Arthur stepped onto her concrete walkway, the front curtain twitched. Seconds later, before he could raise a hand to knock, Evelyn opened the door by a mere 3 inches, secured firmly by a heavy brass security chain. Her eyes weren't warm. They were wide, frantic, and filled with deep-seated suspicion. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice tight, almost trembling with hostility. "Good afternoon," Arthur said, holding up the brown paper bag with a gentle smile. "I'm Arthur, from across the street. Just wanted to welcome you to the block." Evelyn didn't look at the bag. Her eyes darted from Arthur's face down to his hands, then over his shoulder toward his open garage. "I don't buy things from door-to-door visitors. Please leave my property." Arthur blinked, caught off guard by the edge in her voice. "Oh no, I'm not selling anything. I live right there." "I know where you live," she interrupted coldly. "Please leave. I am ordering you off my lawn." The door slammed shut before Arthur could utter another word. He stood on the damp grass for a long moment, bewildered, before sighing and walking back to his own yard. He figured she was simply a private person, perhaps adjusting to a new town. He decided to give her space and stay out of her way. He didn't realize that staying out of her way would prove completely impossible. 2 weeks later, at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, Arthur was sitting in his living room reading a book. The quiet was broken by the sharp flash of emergency lights bouncing off his living room walls. Surprised, he stepped out onto his front porch, thinking there had been a car accident down the road. Instead, a city police cruiser was parked directly at the foot of his driveway. 2 officers stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the light rain. "Mr. Arthur Vance?" the lead officer asked, holding a notepad. "Yes, officer." "Is everything all right?" Arthur asked, adjusting his cardigan. "We received a call from your neighbor across the street," the officer said, pointing toward Evelyn's dark window. "She reported suspicious activity. She claims you were pacing back and forth near her perimeter fence with a flashlight, taking photographs of her windows." Arthur stared at the officers, genuine shock washing over him. What? Officer, I haven't left my house since 4 this afternoon. I was inside reading a book. Do you own a black flashlight, sir? I'm a retired veteran. Officer, I own a few flashlights in my garage, but I haven't been near her property. The officers took his statement, checked his ID, and looked around his front yard. Finding nothing unusual, they apologized for the disturbance and left. Arthur watched them drive away, then looked across the street. Behind the gap in Evelyn's living room curtains, he saw a faint shadow drop out of sight. That night was only the beginning of an escalating nightmare. Within 2 months, the police were coming to Arthur's house almost every week. The complaints grew increasingly absurd, yet relentlessly aggressive. One week, Evelyn called the county marshal claiming Arthur was operating an illegal automotive chop shop in his garage because he had left his power sander running while working on an oak table. The following week, she reported him to animal control, claiming he was luring stray dogs onto her lawn to damage her garden bed, despite Arthur not owning any pets. Then came the property line dispute. Arthur had lived in his house for 5 years before Evelyn arrived, and a thick, well-maintained boxwood hedge had always served as the unspoken boundary between their driveways near the street edge. One Saturday morning, Arthur walked outside to trim the hedge, only to find Evelyn standing on the property boundary with a surveyor's tape measure and a city code enforcement officer. "He's destroying my foliage." Evelyn was shouting at the officer as Arthur approached. "He's trespassing on my land and trying to intimidate me." "Evelyn, this hedge has been here for 15 years, Arthur said calmly, trying to keep his composure. "I'm just trimming the dead branches." "Don't call me Evelyn," she snapped, her face turning pale with rage, her body visibly shaking. "You have no right to touch anything near my line. I know what you're doing. You're trying to push me out. You think because I'm a woman living alone that you can harass me off this street." Arthur felt a knot form in his stomach. The bitterness in her voice was so intense, so deeply felt, that it frightened him far more than the threat of a property fine. The code officer examined the map, confirmed the hedge was actually on municipal easement ground, and urged both of them to work it out amicably. But there was no working it out. As the months turned into years, Arthur's peaceful retirement vanished. He found himself walking on eggshells inside his own home. He stopped sitting on his front porch because every time he did, Evelyn would come out to her porch, pull out her phone, and record him silently from across the street. He started keeping his garage door closed even on warm summer days. The constant stress caused his blood pressure to spike, and the quiet dignity he had built over a lifetime of service was slowly being eroded by suspicion and community gossip. Neighbors who used to wave to Arthur now looked away when they drove by. They saw the police cars parked in front of his house week after week, and assumed that where there was smoke, there had to be fire. By the 3rd year, Arthur felt entirely isolated. The local police officers who responded to the calls knew the situation was a neighborhood feud, but by law, they had to respond to every emergency call Evelyn placed. They grew tired of the endless paperwork, and Arthur grew tired of explaining his innocence to young officers who looked at him with impatience. The resentment inside Arthur began to curdle into cold indifference. He stopped looking across the street. He stopped trying to figure out why she hated him so bitterly. He hardened his heart, convincing himself that Evelyn Croft was simply a toxic, spiteful woman who derived joy from ruining another person's peace. Then came a storm of late October. It was a severe atmospheric river that slammed into the Oregon coast, bringing winds over 60 miles per hour and torrential rain that turned the quiet suburban streets into flowing rivers of mud and debris. By 9 o'clock at night, the power grid failed across the entire county, plunging Oakridge into pitch-black darkness. Arthur sat in his living room by the light of a battery-powered lantern, listening to the deafening roar of the wind whipping through the ancient fir trees surrounding the neighborhood. Heavy branches cracked in the distance like gunshot reports. At precisely 10:15, a sound shattered the roar of the gale, a deep, metallic screech followed by a sickening, thunderous crash that vibrated right through Arthur's hardwood floor. Arthur jumped up, grabbing his heavy rain jacket and a high-lumen tactical flashlight. He stepped out onto his front porch, shielded his eyes against the driving rain, and cut the beam of light through the darkness across the street. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The massive, 80-foot Douglas fir tree that sat on the edge of Evelyn's back lot had snapped near its base under the sheer force of the wind. It had fallen directly across her roof. The entire second floor of her older wooden house was crushed under thousands of pounds of timber and wet earth. The front porch was caved in, and water was pouring freely into the fractured center of her home. Arthur stood on his porch, his heart hammering against his ribs. The street was dead silent except for the howling wind and the rush of water in the gutters. No emergency sirens were sounding. The storm had downed trees across the main highway, completely blocking the county response teams. He pointed his flashlight at the ruined house. In the fractured front window, through the downpour, he saw the faint flicker of a hand tapping desperately against the glass. Arthur's thumb froze on the rubber power button of his flashlight. For 3 agonizing seconds, he didn't move. The driving rain soaked through the shoulders of his heavy jacket, but he barely felt the chill. His mind raced back through 36 months of relentless indignity. He remembered the humiliation of standing on his own front lawn with his hands spread wide while 2 police officers searched his pockets. He remembered the whispers at the local hardware store when neighbors turned their backs on him. He remembered the quiet, poison-filled glare Evelyn directed at him every time he walked out to get his mail. She brought this on herself, a sharp, bitter voice echoed in his head. If you run over there, she'll probably call the cops and say you broke into her house during a storm. He took a half-step back toward his dry, safe front porch. The town's emergency services were undoubtedly flooded with calls, but they would get here eventually. It wasn't his job to play the hero for a woman who had spent 3 years trying to destroy his life. He had served his country, retired, and paid his dues. He owed her nothing. Then, through the roar of the gale, a faint sound carried across the asphalt. It wasn't a shout. It was a weak, terrified sob, followed by a muffled, frantic scraping against the glass. Arthur closed his eyes, taking a deep, steadying breath. His military training, years of logistics, emergency response, and quick decision-making under fire overrode the cold resentment in his chest. A person in immediate danger didn't have a name, a history, or a grudge. They were simply someone who needed help. Damn it, Arthur muttered into the wind. He stepped off his porch and broke into a fast jog across the flooded street, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly over the roaring torrent of muddy water filling the gutters. When he reached Evelyn's front yard, the destruction was far worse than it had looked from across the road. The trunk of the ancient fir tree was thicker than a utility pole, and its massive boughs had sheared off the entire right side of the roof structure. The weight had pushed the central ceiling down, caving in the top floor into the living area below. Splintered cedar beams, shattered drywall, and crushed roof tiles choked the entrance. Arthur clambered over a pile of wet, pine-scented debris and reached the broken front window. He He shone his light through the jagged opening. "Evelyn," he shouted over the deafening roar of the wind. "Evelyn, can you hear me?" Inside, the living room was a scene of total ruin. Rain was pouring down from the gaping hole above, soaking the overturned furniture, shattered lamps, and torn carpets. A heavy support beam from the upper floor had snapped and slammed down across the main hallway archway. "In here," a frail voice gasped from beneath a mountain of fallen drywall and broken timber near the hallway door. "Please, I can't breathe." Arthur didn't hesitate. He cleared the remaining shards of glass from the window frame with the heavy handle of his flashlight, tossed the light inside onto an upturned sofa so it pointed toward the damage, and pulled himself through the window. The air inside was thick with the smell of wet insulation, pulverized sheetrock, and a sharp, metallic odor. "Stay still. I'm coming to you," Arthur called out, his boots crunching on broken frame glass as he crossed the room. He found Evelyn pinned beneath a heavy oak bookshelf that had been thrown forward by the impact of the falling ceiling, trapping her lower body against the floorboards. On top of the bookshelf lay a section of the collapsed plaster ceiling, adding hundreds of pounds of dead weight. She was covered in white drywall dust, her silver hair soaked with rainwater, her face pale with cold and terror. When she raised her head and her eyes caught Arthur's face in the dim beam of the flashlight, her body went rigid. For a second, Arthur thought she was going to scream at him to get out. He braced himself for her usual hostility, for the sharp accusation that he was trespassing on her property. Instead, her lips trembled and tears cut clean tracks through the chalky dust on her cheeks. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice stripped of every drop of the spite she had carried for 3 years. You came? Don't talk," Arthur said firmly, kneeling beside her to assess the weight. "Tell me where it hurts. Are you pinned by your legs?" My legs are stuck," she gasped, her hands clutching weakly at the muddy hem of his jacket. "The shelf? I can't feel my left foot." "Arthur, please." The roof is making noises. Above them, the structural frame of the house groaned ominously under the shifting weight of the massive tree trunk. Water was streaming directly onto Evelyn's chest, and her lips were already turning a dangerous shade of blue from hypothermia. Arthur tested the edge of the oak bookshelf. It was heavy, solid wood, locked down by the plaster debris. He was 58 years old. His lower back ached on cold mornings, and his right knee had never fully recovered from a deployment 20 years ago. If he tried to lift it incorrectly, he could snap the remaining support structure or ruin his own spine, leaving them both trapped in the dark. "Evelyn, listen to me," Arthur said, his voice dropping into the calm, authoritative tone he used during field operations. "I need to pry this off you. When I lift, you have to crawl forward on your elbows. Can you do that?" I don't know," she sobbed, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. "I'm so cold, Arthur. I thought no one knew I was here." "I knew," Arthur said simply, looking down into her terrified eyes. "Now brace yourself." Arthur searched the room with his flashlight beam until he spotted a heavy steel curtain rod that had been torn from the wall. He grabbed it, jammed the thick end underneath the base of the oak bookshelf, and placed a solid block of broken timber underneath it to act as a fulcrum. He wrapped his calloused hands around the metal bar, set his feet firmly on the wet floorboard, and pulled down with everything he had. The muscles in his back burned, and his breath hissed through his teeth as the rusty bar bent under the immense pressure. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, the heavy oak shelf began to lift off Evelyn's legs. "Go! Crawl!" Arthur roared through gritted teeth. Evelyn dug her fingers into the soaked carpet and dragged herself forward, crying out in pain as her legs cleared the wooden frame. The moment she was clear, the temporary lever snapped in half with a sharp crack, and the bookshelf crashed back down onto the floor, throwing up a cloud of wet plaster dust. Arthur dropped to his knees, gasping for air, his arms shaking from the exertion. He immediately pulled Evelyn away from the structural collapse, wrapping his heavy canvas jacket around her trembling shoulders. "Are you broken anywhere?" he asked, checking her hands and ankles for obvious fractures. I think my leg is just bruised," she stammered, staring at him in complete disbelief as if looking at a ghost. You saved me." "We're not out yet," Arthur said, looking up as another loud crack reverberated through the ceiling joists. "The center of the house is collapsing. We need to get back out that window before the rest of the roof gives way." He helped her to her feet, supporting almost all of her weight as she limped toward the front window. But as they reached the living room center, Arthur's flashlight beam caught something lying on the soaked rug near the front door, something that had spilled out of Evelyn's open coat pocket during the crash. It was a thick, worn leather binder, its pages splayed open in the water. Arthur's eyes caught the top of the spilled papers. They were high-resolution photographs of his own home, dozens of them, taken from her window, from behind trees, from the edge of the street, dating back 3 entire years. There were handwritten logs listing the exact times he left his house, the license plates of every visitor who had ever parked in his driveway, and highlighted legal documents detailing property seizure laws. Evelyn noticed him staring at the binder. Her breath hitched, and a sudden, terrible look of absolute horror crossed her face. Not from the storm, but from the secret that now lay exposed between them. The beam of Arthur's tactical flashlight seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. The howling wind outside faded into a dull, distant roar, replaced by the deafening silence of a betrayal too vast for words. He remained on one knee, frozen, his fingers tightening on the grip of the metal light. It wasn't just a book of memories or petty grievances. It was a cold, calculated dossier. It was a tactical roadmap of his private life, compiled with an obsession that chilled him more than the cold rainwater dripping down his neck. For 3 years, he had attributed her behavior to loneliness, perhaps a mental health struggle, or simple, old-fashioned bitterness. He had felt like an innocent man unjustly targeted. Now, staring at the surveillance photos and handwritten charts, the reality hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just accidentally her target. He was her project. She had systematically documented his life, waiting for a slip-up, building a case to erase his existence from this neighborhood. "Please," Evelyn's voice trembled, breaking the silence. She huddled against a pile of wet plaster, gripping the edge of Arthur's jacket, the very jacket he had selflessly thrown over her shoulders seconds ago. The irony was so bitter he could almost taste it. "Please, Arthur, we have to go." The roof. Arthur looked up, slowly, from the binder to her pale, terrified face. The image of the desperate woman who had pleaded for her life minutes ago clashed violently with the image of the methodical tormentor revealed in the binder. The surge of empathy that had driven him to risk his own safety was replaced by an icy, paralyzing shock. All this time, Arthur said, his voice low, lacking all emotion. It was the calm, detached voice he used when calculating logistics, not when speaking to a human being. "Every siren, every time my blood pressure spiked, you were just building your little database." "You don't understand," Evelyn stammered, fresh tears spilling onto the white drywall, dust on her cheeks. I had to protect myself. Men like you think you own everything. After what happened to my husband. I don't care about your husband, Evelyn. Arthur cut her off, his voice hardening. I care that I couldn't sit on my own porch without you calling the cops. I care that you tried to get me fired, try to get me fined, try to frame me for crimes I didn't commit. Another structure-jarring crack echoed from the second floor. A large piece of wet sheetrock detached from the ceiling and smashed onto the sofa nearby, splashing mud and water onto both of them. The house was failing rapidly. Evelyn screamed, a sharp, piercing sound of raw panic. Arthur, please. Don't leave me here. I'll pay for everything. I'll stop. Just get me out. Arthur stared at her. The ultimate moral crossroads lay open before him. The survival instinct that had driven him into the house clashed violently with the sudden, powerful urge for justice. She had dedicated years to destroying his life. This was karma, delivered by the hand of nature. If he simply stood up and walked out, no one would ever know. The house would collapse, her secrets would be buried with her, and his life would, finally, be peaceful. Would you still help her when disaster struck? The question pulsed in his mind. For an eternity that lasted maybe 5 seconds, he wrestled with the choice. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he clicked the flashlight off, plunging them both into the terrifying, absolute blackness of the collapsed living room. Evelyn gasped, a soft sob of pure terror. Arthur? No, please. In the darkness, Arthur picked up the metal curtain rod he had used as a lever. He didn't speak. He just waited. When he clicked the light back on 10 seconds later, its beam was no longer focused on the binder, but directly on her face. His expression was utterly inscrutable, his mouth set in a grim line. He had made his decision. Without saying a word, Arthur scooped up the heavy binder from the soaked floorboards and shoved it deep into the large inner pocket of his jacket. Evelyn watched him with wide, terrified eyes, reaching out a trembling hand as if to stop him, but her strength failed her. Arthur, please, get on my back, Arthur commanded, his voice cold and devoid of warmth. Hold on around my neck. Do not let go, no matter what happens. Evelyn didn't argue. The terror of being crushed alive by the collapsing second floor far outweighed her fear of the man she had hunted for 3 years. She wrapped her frail arms around Arthur's neck, her body shaking so violently that he could feel her heart pounding against his back. Arthur braced himself, grunted under the combined weight, and stood up. His right knee buckled for a split second, sending a sharp, familiar jab of pain up his leg, but he locked his joint and forced himself forward. Above them, another wooden beam split with a loud sound of thunder. Drywall dust and heavy rainwater showered down on them as Arthur pushed through the cracked front window frame, stepping back out into the fury of the gale. The storm raged around them, but Arthur didn't slow down. He carried Evelyn across the flooded lawn, his boots splashing through ankle-deep mud, until they reached the asphalt of the street and finally stepped onto his own front porch. He kicked his front door open, carried her inside into his dry, warm hallway, and gently set her down onto a wooden armchair in his living room. Evelyn collapsed into the seat, gasping for breath, clutching a drywall blanket that Arthur tossed into her lap. He immediately stepped away, turning his back on her as he walked over to his wood-burning stove to stoke the dying embers, giving her a sense of warmth and himself a moment of space. For several minutes, the only sounds in the dark room were the howling wind outside, the crackle of the wood fire, and Evelyn's erratic breathing. Arthur pulled the thick, damp binder from his jacket and placed it heavy on the coffee table between them. The sound of the binder hitting the wood sounded like a gavel falling in a courtroom. Evelyn shrank back into the armchair, pulling the blanket up to her chin, unable to meet his gaze. "You're safe," Arthur said, standing over the table, his arms crossed over his chest. "The storm will pass by morning. Emergency crews will clear the road by noon." "Arthur," her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know what to say." "Start with the truth," Arthur said, his eyes narrowing in the dim firelight. "You spent 3 years calling the police on me. You tried to ruin my reputation in this town. You logged my sleep schedule, my guests, my movements. What?" Evelyn closed her eyes, tears leaking through her wrinkled eyelids. "Because I was terrified of you." Arthur let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Terrified of me? I've done nothing to you, Evelyn. I brought you bread the day you moved in. And my ex-husband brought flowers to our neighbors the day before he tried to kill me." Evelyn suddenly snapped back, her voice cracking with raw, unhealed trauma. Arthur stopped cold. Evelyn buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving as years of suppressed anguish spilled out in the quiet room. 20 years ago," she sobbed, "I was married to a man who looked just like you. A retired military officer, respected by everyone in town. Polite, quiet, generous to strangers. But behind closed doors, he was a monster. He controlled every breath I took. He tracked my phone, he watched who I spoke to, and when I tried to leave him, he almost ended my life. I spent 6 months in a hospital recovery ward." Arthur stared at her, the anger in his chest suddenly wavering against an unexpected wave of horror. "When I bought the house across the street, I swore no man would ever control me again," Evelyn continued, her voice trembling. "When you came to my door with that bread, when I saw your military posture, the way you moved, the way you carried yourself, every instinct in my body screamed that you were just like him. A wolf in sheep's clothing, hiding behind a polite smile. So you attacked me first," Arthur said softly, realization dawning on him. "I thought if I made enough noise, if I involved the police early, I would create a record," she whispered, looking up at him with eyes full of sorrow. "I thought if I pushed hard enough, I would force you to drop the act and show your true face. I convinced myself that every time you looked out your window, you were plotting against me." The room fell quiet again. Arthur looked down at the binder on the table, not as a collection of malice, but as the tragic record of a woman trapped in the prison of her own unhealed past, fighting an enemy who existed only in her memories. Before Arthur could speak, a strange, frantic buzzing sound began to vibrate from inside the back pocket of Evelyn's wet coat. Evelyn froze. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her paler than she had been inside the collapsing house. "What is that?" Arthur asked. My secondary phone," Evelyn whispered, her voice filled with a brand new, terrifying kind of dread. "No one has that number. Only one person." The sharp, erratic vibration of the small burner phone on the coffee table sounded like a buzzing hornet against the quiet crackle of the wood stove. Arthur's eyes shifted from the phone to Evelyn. Her hand was shaking so violently that she couldn't even reach out to grab the coat. The sheer, naked terror on her face was different from the panic she had shown during the storm. This wasn't fear of a falling house. It was the paralyzed dread of a long-buried nightmare coming back to life. "Who has that number, Evelyn?" Arthur asked, his voice steady but cautious. "He was supposed to be in prison," she choked out, her breath coming in ragged gasps. 20 years. The judge gave him 20 years without parole. Arthur felt a sudden, cold knot form in his chest. Your ex-husband. Evelyn nodded frantically, tears streaming unchecked down her face. His name is Richard. When he was sentenced, he swore to me in the courtroom that he would track me down the moment he got out. He said he'd find whatever peaceful life I built and burn it to the ground. That phone, I kept that prepaid line active for 15 years just in case court notifications or victim relief services try to reach me. The phone stopped buzzing for a second, then immediately began ringing again. The illuminated caller ID showed an unknown, unlisted county number. Answer it, Arthur said softly. Put on speaker. I can't, she whimpered, curling tighter into the wool blanket. I can't hear his voice, Arthur. Please. Arthur reached across the table, picked up the small flip phone, slid his thumb over the button, and clicked speaker. He set it back down between them. A heavy, wet cough rattled through the speaker, followed by the sound of wind howling in the background. The very same storm raging outside Arthur's window. Evelyn, a deep, raspy, completely unhurried male voice echoed into the living room. I know you're listening, sweetheart. Evelyn clamped her hand over her mouth to muffle a sob. I got released 3 weeks ago. The voice continued, smooth and sinister, like rust dragging over steel. You thought you hid well in that rainy little logging town, didn't you? It took me a few days to trace your property deed, but I found you. I've been watching your street from the tree line for the past 48 hours. Arthur's jaw tightened. He glanced at Evelyn, whose eyes were wide with pure horror. I saw the tree go through your roof tonight, Evelyn. Richard chuckled softly, a dry, cold sound. I saw that old man carry you across the road into his house. Isn't that sweet? You always were so quick to run to another man for protection. Arthur leaned down toward the phone, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp, quiet register. Who is this? A brief pause hung on the line. Then Richard laughed again. Ah, the helpful neighbor. Mr. Vance, right? Retired Army logistics? I've been reading up on you too, while sitting in my truck. Listen to me very carefully, old man. This isn't your business. This is between a husband and his wife. She belongs to me, and we have 20 years of lost time to settle. She doesn't belong to anyone, Arthur said calmly, standing up and stepping between the table and Evelyn. And if you're watching this house, you know you're standing out in a storm on private property. I'm standing at the edge of your driveway, Arthur, Richard said, his tone turning ice cold. The power is out across the entire county. The roads are blocked by fallen timber. The police aren't coming to save you tonight. You hand Evelyn over, or I come inside and step over your corpse to get her. The line went dead with a sharp click. Silence fell over the room once more, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn fell off the chair on her knees on the floor, clutching Arthur's pant leg, sobbing uncontrollably. I brought him here. I brought him right to your door. I'm so sorry, Arthur. I'm so sorry. Arthur looked out the front window into the pitch-black, storm-swept yard. The headlights of an idling truck flashed once through the heavy rain at the end of his driveway, 200 feet away. For 3 years, Arthur had viewed Evelyn as his tormentor. But now, as he stood in the dark with a violent convict outside his door and a broken, traumatized woman weeping at his feet, he realized the ultimate dilemma he was facing. He could hand her over or lock her in a closet and run out the back door to save himself. Or he could stand his ground and fight a war that wasn't his. Arthur didn't react with panic. His 24 years in logistics and tactical operations under high stress had taught him one absolute truth. Panic was a luxury that cost lives. He looked down at Evelyn, kneeling on the floor, her hands clasped together in desperate entreaty. The woman who had spent 3 years tormenting him with false police reports and paranoid surveillance was now completely shattered, stripped of all defenses. "Get up, Evelyn," Arthur said, his voice flat, steady, and devoid of fear. "Arthur, please. You have to leave," she whimpered, trying to pull herself up against the edge of the wooden coffee table. "He's dangerous. He won't hesitate to hurt you. If you give me a raincoat, I'll walk out there. I'll go to him, just don't let him break into your house." Arthur stared at her for a second. The ultimate sacrifice. After 3 years of trying to push him away, her immediate instinct when real danger arrived was to sacrifice herself to spare him. The irony wasn't lost on him. "You're not going anywhere near that driveway," Arthur said firmly. He grabbed her by the arm, lifted her to her feet, and led her quickly toward the hallway closet near the back of the house. "You get inside here. Lock it from the inside if you can, or hold the handle tight. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear out in the living room." "Arthur." "In the closet. Now." He closed the heavy oak door on her, listening to the soft click of the latch. Arthur turned back toward the dark living room. The idling truck at the end of the driveway hadn't moved, but the headlights suddenly switched from low to high beam, casting long, stark shadows through Arthur's front windows. A thick silhouette stepped out from the driver's side of the vehicle, slamming the heavy truck door shut. Arthur moved swiftly and silently through his home. He didn't reach for a weapon or a firearm. He reached for knowledge. He went into his hallway utility cabinet, pulled out a second tactical flashlight, and flipped the breaker switch on his solar-charged emergency battery bank. Deep in the basement, a muffled hum kicked in, sending low, warm power through a select few secondary light circuits in the house. Outside, heavy, wet boots crunched over the gravel of the driveway, slowly approaching the front steps. Richard was taking his time. He was enjoying the terror, confident that the storm, the power outage, and the isolated location gave him total control over the situation. Arthur stepped into the living room, standing 10 feet back from the front door, right in the center of the room. He didn't hide. He didn't lock the deadbolt. He simply stood there in the shadows, his hands resting naturally at his sides. The front porch floorboards creaked under heavy weight. A shadow passed over the frosted glass of the front entry door. Then the brass doorknob turned slowly, clicking as the latch released. The front door swung open, letting in a gust of freezing, rain-soaked wind that whipped the curtains into a frenzy. Standing on the threshold was Richard Croft. He was a large, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, wearing a heavy canvas work jacket slick with rain. His face was weathered, scarred near the jawline, and his eyes carried the cold, hollow emptiness of a man who had spent 2 decades behind steel bars with nothing but bitterness for company. In his right hand, loosely gripped at his side, was a heavy iron tire crowbar. Richard stepped across the threshold onto the hardwood floor, water dripping from his boots. He glanced around the dimly lit room, his eyes scanning the furniture before settling on Arthur. "You're a foolish old man, Arthur," Richard said, his voice grating like dry stone. "I gave you a choice. Where is she?" Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't step back. "You made a mistake coming here, Richard." Richard let out a dark, mocking chuckle, lifting the heavy tire iron a few inches off his hip. "Is that right? You think your Army record frightens me? I've spent 20 years living with killers, thieves, and animals. You're just a retired clerk living in a cozy little house. I was a logistics specialist. Arthur corrected softly, his voice chillingly calm. Which means I don't start a fight unless I've already calculated every single variable in advance. Richard's smile faded slightly, his eyes narrowing as he took another step forward into the room. Is that supposed to impress me? Last chance, Arthur. Tell me where my wife is, or I tear this house apart starting with your head. She's not your wife anymore, Arthur said, and you're not leaving this property tonight. Richard raised the iron bar, his knuckles turning white as he lunged forward with a brutal, heavy swing aimed straight for Arthur's head. Richard swung the heavy iron crowbar with vicious, practiced speed. The rusted metal sliced through the air, aimed directly for Arthur's temple. In a split second, Arthur's decades of conditioned reflex took over. He didn't try to block the weapon with his arms. Instead, he stepped fast into the arc of the swing, closing the distance before the tire iron reached maximum momentum. Arthur's left forearm collided hard with Richard's wrist, arresting the strike midair. Pain shot up Arthur's arm, but he ignored it, sliding his right hand behind Richard's head and driving his knee firmly into Richard's solar plexus. Richard wheezed, the air rushing out of his lungs with a wet gasp. He stumbled backward into the center of the room, his boots sliding on the damp hardwood floor. You think you're tough, old man, Richard hissed, clutching his stomach, his eyes bloodshot with sudden, primal fury. You don't know what I've survived. Richard roared, lunging again, not with a weapon, but using his heavy weight to tackle Arthur to the ground. Both men crashed hard onto the floorboards near the coffee table, scattering the contents of Evelyn's binder across the wet rug. The heavy tire iron flew from Richard's grip, clattering loudly across the floor and sliding into the dark hallway near the closet door. Inside the closet, Evelyn pressed her back against the far wall, her hands clasped tightly over her mouth to muffle her screams. Through the wooden slats of a door, she could hear the brutal sound of flesh striking flesh, heavy breathing, and furniture splintering under impact. On the living room floor, Richard pinned Arthur down, his heavy hands locking around Arthur's throat. You should have minded your own business. Richard snarled, his face inches from Arthur's. His thumb pressed violently into Arthur's windpipe, cutting off his oxygen supply. She was mine. She belonged to me. Arthur's vision began to blur around the edges. Dark spots danced before his eyes as his oxygen rapidly faded. His hands clawed weakly at Richard's thick wrists, but Richard's grip was like a steel vise forged by 20 years of prison labor. Is this how it ends? A voice echoed in Arthur's fading consciousness. Dying in the dark for a woman who called the police on you every single week? He looked past Richard's shoulder. On the floor, just 3 inches from his outstretched hand, lay the heavy leather binder, the dossier Evelyn had kept on him for 3 years. Among the spilled pages was a small, plastic laminated card that had fallen out of the back pouch. It was an official document from the Oregon Victim Protection Services. Printed at the top in bold red letters was a restraining order dated 20 years ago, accompanied by medical photos of Evelyn's bruised, broken face from a night Richard had nearly taken her life. In that fleeting second, the last lingering shadow of resentment in Arthur's heart completely disintegrated. She wasn't a malicious monster who hated him. She was a deeply broken victim who had spent 20 years running from a real monster, terrified that every man she met would turn out to be the same. A sudden surge of adrenaline flared through Arthur's veins. Using the last remaining strength in his body, Arthur didn't pull at Richard's hands. Instead, he reached out, grabbed the heavy battery-powered lantern sitting on the edge of the coffee table, and slammed it upward with full force into the side of Richard's jaw. The plastic housing shattered on impact. The sharp blow dislodged Richard's jaw with a sickening crack, breaking his grip instantly. Richard shrieked in pain, clutching his broken face as blood trickled from his lip. Arthur rolled out from under him, coughing violently, gasping cold air back into his burning lungs. He didn't waste a second. As Richard stumbled to his knees, Arthur scrambled across the floor, grabbed the heavy iron tire bar from near the hallway wall, and stood up over him. Arthur raised the tire bar high above his head, his face illuminated by the flickering, broken light of the battery pack. Richard looked up from the floor, his jaw crooked, his eyes wide with sudden, genuine horror. For the first time in 20 years, he was looking at a man who was ready to put an end to his reign of terror once and for all. "Do it!" Richard spat weakly, blood dripping onto his coat. "Strike me, old man." Arthur stood perfectly still, the iron bar hovering in the air. His muscles trembled with fatigue, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. The entire fate of 3 lives hung, suspended on the razor edge of his next breath. Arthur held the heavy iron bar, suspended in the air. The rain outside lashed against the broken window, and Richard glared up at him with dark, venomous eyes, waiting for the strike. For 3 long seconds, Arthur's body remained locked in the posture of a soldier ready to inflict fatal force. Every instinct born from decades of discipline urged him to put an end to the threat once and for all. Then, Arthur took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold air clear the red haze of adrenaline from his mind. He lowered the heavy iron bar, stepping back 2 paces. "No," Arthur said softly, his voice steady and resolute. "I'm not like you." Before Richard could react, the sharp, wailing sirens of multiple emergency vehicles echoed down the road. The county road crews had cleared the fallen timber on the main highway, and the blinding red and blue lights swept across the living room walls. Police officers burst through the open front door with flashlights drawn. Within seconds, Richard was forced onto his stomach, handcuffed, and dragged out into the storm to face the 20-year justice he had tried to evade. The heavy oak closet door clicked open. Evelyn stepped out into the dim room, her eyes wide as she looked at Arthur. She didn't look at him with fear or suspicion anymore. For the first time in 3 years, her eyes reflected pure, profound gratitude. 2 weeks later, the storm had fully passed. Soft autumn sunlight flooded the quiet suburban street of Oakridge. Evelyn's ruined house across the street was surrounded by construction scaffolding as workers repaired the damaged roof. Evelyn stood on Arthur's front porch, holding a small brown paper bag, a fresh batch of bread from the local bakery. She held it out to Arthur with hands that no longer trembled. "I spent 3 years convinced you were my worst nightmare, Arthur," Evelyn said, tears welling in her eyes. "You had every reason in the world to leave me in that collapsing house, but you chose kindness when I gave you nothing but pain." Arthur accepted the bread with a gentle, knowing smile. "Sometimes, Evelyn, people build walls so high that the only way to see over them is when a storm tears them down." She nodded slowly, wiping a tear from her cheek, and looked out at the peaceful street. The silent war between them was finally over. Life has a way of testing our character in the moments we least expect. It is easy to show kindness to those who love us, but the true measure of our morality is how we respond to those who have wronged us. Arthur Vance could have walked away. He could have allowed 3 years of bitterness to justify cold indifference. Instead, He chose compassion over revenge, proving that humanity shines brightest in the darkest storms. Thank you for watching today's story on truth or choice. If this story touched your heart or made you reflect on forgiveness, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to help us bring you more powerful moral dilemma stories. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to help someone who hurt you? Now it's your turn. If you were in this situation, would you choose the truth or make a different choice? Tell us in the comments.